Well, good morning, everyone. I am not Rick, and Rick asked me if I would stand in for him this morning. He'll be away, and said he will be back tonight. So we're looking at the parable of the tares, and then I noticed that the slides, this is on, correct? And then I noticed that the slides also talk about, kind of back off and talk about the parables in general. So I want to expand upon that as we proceed. So again, the parable of the tares, and let's take a look at these cards, and we'll just go through these quickly. Card number 103, sowed in the field. And the answer to that is? We all have this memorized, right? We're not reading the cards. Since we want to do well next week in the contest with the babies, right? Very good. So, good seed, according to the card, right? The good seed, or wheat, and then tares, the weeds. Matthew chapter 13, verses 24 to 25. The good seed is, and the tares, or the weeds, are. Good, respectively, yep. And then the field is, the enemy is, the harvest is, and the reapers are. Excellent, excellent. All that from memory. Right? No? Okay, so the field is, yep, go back. The world, and then we have the devil, the end of the world, and then the angels referenced in Matthew 13, verses 38 to 39. Notice that the world there on the slide, I say discussion for later. At the end of the session tonight, this morning, I would like to engage in some discussion items. So I have made a list of several discussion items, and I would like to see if we can generate some comments and discussion on some of these. One of them will be this expression, the world. Meaning, back off and look at the overall meaning of the parable of the tare. It should be parable of the tares, not parables. And the answer to that is? Right, yep. Who is handling Socrative for me this morning? Is anyone doing that this morning? Well, he is, okay. So just interrupt me if you would, if there is a comment there. And then, so evil people will not be cast out until the end of the world. That gives rise to the question, cast out of what? So let's be thinking about that. And then why, now he's getting away from the parable of the tares, and these are now talking about parables in general. Apparently, since we've already covered, and this is the last time we're going to be looking at parables in this series. And so then whoever authored these cards now wants you to think about the parables in general. So why did Jesus teach parables? Yeah. To reveal the truth and to hide the truth. To reveal the truth, I understand. To hide the truth? So we'll be discussing that as well. Why would Jesus want to hide the truth? And then parables reveal truth to those who want to know the truth. That gives you the answer to that question, doesn't it? He hides the truth then from those that don't want the truth. So let's, all right, those who want to know the truth, right? And then the next card, 109, he that hath ears to hear, and the response to that is again? let him hear. Matthew 13, verse 9. Now, diving in, now that we've looked at those cards, let's go back, and what I'd like to do is, since this is the last class on parables in this series, give you a suggested outline for organizing a study of the parables of Jesus for your own personal study and or a future class or course for you to consider. So, Roman numeral 1, what is, I would address in a course of study on the parables, at least for a quarter, maybe even 2 quarters, or for a course in a school of preaching, or at the college level if we were to go into more detail. Roman numeral number 1, what is a parable of Jesus and how does it teach? And Jesus himself answers this in Mark chapter 4, verse 30 to begin with. There are 2 answers to this. One is Mark chapter 4, verse 30. This reads, "Then he said, 'To what shall we liken the kingdom of God? Or with what parable shall we picture it?'" So that gives you insight right there from Jesus' perspective, which is the best perspective, as to what a parable is. A parable of Jesus, then, pictures things beyond the earthly story that's given. Jesus gives a story about something familiar in daily life. Now, some of those may not be familiar to us today, but back in that culture, if they're not familiar with us today, then it would be useful to talk about the details of the earthly story. He gives a story about something familiar, and then he wants us to see the corresponding spiritual truths and expect those truths, at least sometimes, if not always, to have something to do with the kingdom, his kingdom. So there are 2 sides to a parable of Jesus. And one is the earthly story itself. So I've given you that on the right-hand side of the slide. You'll see that we have the earthly story, and then there are elements within that earthly story that are intended to transfer over into a spiritual teaching. And so then the task of interpreting parables is to observe those elements of the earthly story and then try to answer the question, well, what spiritual lesson corresponds with that particular element, and then go to the next element and so forth. So again, there are 2 sides. One is the earthly story and the other is a set of spiritual teachings he wants us to see, and also he wants us to back off and look at the general meaning, the overall meaning of the parable. So there are elements within the parable that have some kind of a corresponding spiritual teaching, but also the overall parable itself has some overall theme, and he wants us to see what that is. He wants us to think that through. So as we continue with Roman numeral 1 in an extended study of parables, we are addressing, well, what is a parable of Jesus? Again, that's Mark chapter 4, verse 30. And then how does it teach? This is addressed in Matthew 13, verses 10 to 13. "And the disciples came and said to him, 'Why do you speak to them in parables?' He answered and said to them, 'Because,'" and note what I've highlighted here in white, "'because it has been given to you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given.'" Now, in context, the preceding verses show that he is speaking to the multitudes, Matthew 13, verses 1 to 3. Verse 12, for whoever has, to him more will be given, and he who will have abundance, but whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken away from them. So therefore, verse 13, "Therefore I speak to them," that's the multitude, verses 1 to 3 of Matthew 13, "Therefore I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand." And then he cites a reference in the book of Isaiah, chapter 6, verses 9 to 10, and in that passage, this is found in Matthew 13, 14 to 15, where he cites a reference back to Isaiah, and he says this idea of their not understanding was predicted by Isaiah in chapter 6, 9 to 10. So, to reveal truth to those who want it and to hide truth from those who don't is, as the card said, gives us insight into how a parable of Jesus teaches. And then Roman numeral 2, in an overall detailed study of parables, I would advise that we understand what the kingdom of Jesus is, and there are at least two meanings of this in the scriptures. Of course, there is a third meaning of kingdom, namely the physical, the material kingdom. But there is a figurative use of kingdom used in the scriptures, at least two. One is that it stands for the church. And this is made evident by comparing, and we won't do this right now, but on your own, if you wanted to, you could see that usage by comparing Mark chapter 9, verse 1 with Acts 2, 29 through 36. And this is one of many figures of speech in the Bible that are used in reference to the church. There are many. If you want an expanded study of that, a wonderful study, our brother L.V. Pfeiffer, who died just a few years ago, wrote a document, made it available to everybody, titled The New Testament Church. And I knew Brother Pfeiffer quite well, and I asked him if he would put in the front of that document a permission for anyone to copy it and distribute it, and he did that. So, and I have that as a PDF. If anybody wants a copy of that, let me know. It's a wonderful study on the New Testament church, and part of that study demonstrates clearly from multiple passages that the church is sometimes used, I should say the kingdom is sometimes used as a figurative reference to the church. But not only do we have kingdom used in the Bible for the church, but there are many metaphors, many figures of speech that are used to refer to the church. John 15 refers to, Jesus says, I am the vine, you are the branches. So the vine and the branches, that's a reference to the church and church members. We're called priests over in 1 Peter chapter 2, and of course the idea of a kingdom, that implies that there is a king and there is a kingdom, and then there are citizens in the kingdom, and there is authority from the king over the citizens, etc. So that idea of the kingdom referring to the church is expanded upon in those details. So there are other studies that we could make too of these different figures of speech used in the Bible with respect to the church, one of them being the kingdom. A second meaning of kingdom used in the scriptures is that it stands for heaven, and you see this in Matthew chapter 7, verse 21, for example. This says, not everyone who says unto me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he that does the will of my Father who is in heaven. That's a reference to heaven. And so then kingdom, used in a figurative sense, is sometimes used in reference to heaven. So, and we could go into that in a lot more detail. So what is the kingdom of Jesus? A third Roman numeral in a detailed study of parables that I would address is an answer to the question, are there recommended helps for studying the parables of Jesus? And there are. A classic since the 19th century is by R.C. Trench, titled Notes on the Parables of Our Lord. There are two versions of that. One is detailed, getting into some of the details of the Greek. Others are not as the other version is not as technical. So Richard C. Trench, Notes on the Parables of the Lord, of Our Lord, a classic commentary on the parables of Jesus. More recently, Craig L. Blomberg in his wrote as I recall, this is his doctoral dissertation, and then put it into a book form titled Interpreting the Parables, and then a second publication by Blomberg, Preaching the Parables. So this is Blomberg's book, Interpreting the Parables, and then Preaching the Parables by Blomberg. Again, the New Testament Church publication by L.V. Pfeiffer. And then furthermore, if you want to expand upon the various figures of speech in the Bible that are used in reference to the church, probably the best available is this by Paul S. Miniar, titled Images of the Church in the New Testament. Now, with all of these, my advice is that you check everything by the Bible as an independent thinker. And I'm assuming that that does not need to be said. That should be obvious. 1 Thessalonians 5:21, prove all things, hold fast that which is good. 2 Timothy 2:15, give diligence to preserve give diligence or study, as the old King James puts it, to make yourself approved to God. So Roman numeral 3, if we were to pursue this further, a detailed study of the parables. Number 4, now I would get to the parables of Jesus themselves, and I made up a list over the decades, a little sheet that I came up with that gives a list of 34 parables of Jesus and their New Testament passages where they're documented. If anybody wants a copy of that, let me know, and you can get a copy. And then, so that would help by just looking at the whole picture, all of the parables, or most of them in the New Testament scriptures. Notice we're talking about the parables of Jesus here. There are other parables in the Bible. We're talking here about the parables of Jesus. And then I would get into a discussion of whether or not the account of the rich man and Lazarus is a parable in Luke chapter 16. There is controversy there. I argue that it is not a parable. And I would argue, and I would give evidence as to why I can so conclude. And then begin with the parable of the sower and or the parable of the tares. And I notice that this morning we're looking at the parable of the tares at the very end of the study. I would put the parable of the sower and or the parable of the tares first. And the reason for that is that Jesus provides in each of these two cases the interpretation of the parable. So that's a good start when studying. And that he gives you insight then in practice as to how to interpret parables. Those two are models for doing that. And then I would study the parable of the unjust judge. I noticed that was last Wednesday night, since this shows that not all elements of a parable are intended to have a corresponding spiritual teaching. Some elements of a parable are there only like window dressing, setting up the overall idea. And so then it would be wrong to try to transfer into some kind of a doctrine an element that had no intent of so teaching a spiritual lesson. So that would be, and the best parable for showing that, I would say, or at least one of the best, is the parable of the unjust judge. And then I would study the parable of the friend at midnight, since it teaches the same thing that the parable of the unjust judge does, namely persist in prayer. And then study the remaining parables of Jesus in any desired order. So that's how I would jump in, and if you wanted to have a study in some detail just on the parables. In an adult Bible class, in an auditorium class such as this, you could easily occupy a quarter, if not 2, with that study of the parables. So now let's focus our attention on this particular parable, namely the parable of the tares. And this is found only in Matthew 13, verses 24 to 30. And then we have Jesus' interpretation of it given in 36 to 43. The word tares, then, I looked this up and came up with this helpful definition from encyclopedia.com. Quote, the darnel, so it's otherwise known as the darnel, and it's a weed which grows among grain, particularly wheat, and the grains resemble those of wheat so that it is very difficult to separate them. And furthermore, darnel, or tares, the flour that is made from this is poisonous. So We're looking at Matthew 13, 24 to 30, then beginning. I'm reading from the New King James. And notice how this dovetails nicely into what we said over in Mark, referencing Mark chapter 4, verse 30, what a parable is. It's a picture of something, and in particular, a picture of the kingdom of God, the kingdom of Jesus. So, and that comes out with the word, you can see that coming through, rather, in this parable with the word like. Verse 24, then beginning, Matthew 13, another parable he put forth to them, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like a man who, he's now going to give you the physical story, the earthly story, and he expects you to transfer into spiritual lessons from these elements of the parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while men slept, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went his way. But when the grain had sprouted and produced a crop, then the tares also appeared. So the servants of the owner came and said to him, Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have tares? He said to them, an enemy has done this. The servant said to him, do you want us then to go and gather them up? But he said, no, lest while you gather up the tares, you also uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. And at the time of the harvest, I will say to the reapers, first gather together the tares and bind them in bundles to burn them, but gather the wheat into my barn. So again, we have, as is the case with the parables of Jesus, we have two sides to this. First, the earthly story is given, and there are certain elements within the earthly story that are identified. And he's expecting us then to make a transfer from these elements over to the respective spiritual teaching. He continues, now he gives us an interpretation. You do not always have his interpretation of the parable. You do, as I say, in the sower parable and in the tares parable. Somebody have a comment back there, Phil? Oh, go ahead.
Just a couple comments on Socrative. Someone said, you don't need other books, only need the Bible and prayer. No need to buy other books. I guess this is referring to the parables, because then they asked, can we review parables with the Bible only?
It's a biblical option. As we're going through this class, and as other Bible teachers go through the class describing the Bible, notice that when we speak, we are not using word for word literal words coming out of the Bible, right? We're commenting on these. And so then they can serve as some commentaries can serve as helps, as we ourselves are doing right now in describing these parables, would be my observation. So looking at 36 to 43, here we have Jesus' interpretation of the parable. So this is helpful in giving us a guide as to how to interpret parables. So verse 36, then Jesus sent the multitude away and went into the house, and his disciples came to him saying, explain to us the parable of the tares in the field. He answered and said to them, he who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. That is, he represents the Son of Man. The earthly story, the part that talks about the sowing of the good seed, that's the Son of Man who is sowing the Word of God. The field is the world. The good seeds are the sons of the kingdom, otherwise known as Christians today, right? But the tares are the sons of the wicked one. Now, everybody is either a son of God or a son of the devil, according to the Scriptures, because we want to be the son of God, the sons of God. The enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are the angels. Therefore, as the tares are gathered and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of this age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all things that offend and those who practice lawlessness, and will cast them into the furnace of fire. There will be wailing and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Now he's focusing then on the spiritual side, on the right-hand side of the slide, telling us what the spiritual correspondence is to these various elements within the parable of the tare. What's that? Okay. So the elements in the earthly story, he who sows corresponds with Jesus, the field corresponds with the world, the good seeds represent the sons of the kingdom, or Christians, tares represent lost people, harvest is the end of the age, reaper is the angels, burning, would you agree with me that the burning in the earthly story corresponds to, that is, represents the lost in the afterlife? In hell? And then shining in the God's kingdom, these are the wheat. They are shining in God's kingdom in the earthly story. They represent the saved in the afterlife, don't they? Correct.
Yeah, I was going to say that. Whoa. Not that loud.
You have a strong voice this morning.
Yeah, right. I was going to say that any southern person, most generally, will understand if you talk about crabgrass. Tares are kind of like crabgrass. You don't want that growing where you want good grass. Mm-hmm. And so I've seen my father go through the field sometimes and pull up the crabgrass and throw it in the balk, we call it, so that the sun would dry it and get rid of it.
Yeah.
So you want to get rid of all of the things that are not what you want to grow.
Right. So that lends itself nicely to spiritual lessons, which is exactly what the Lord is doing here, right? So again, elements in the earthly story have a correspondence on the spiritual side. Now, let's take a few minutes here to see if I can generate some discussion. And I welcome your input on this. Let me call to your attention Matthew 13, 27 to 30 again, and then I have some discussion items. So the servants of the owner came and said to him, "Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have tares?" He said to them, "An enemy has done this." The servant said to him, "Do you want us then to go and gather them up?" No. But he said, "No, lest while you gather up the tares, you also uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow until the harvest, and at the time of harvest, I will say to the reapers, first gather together the tares and bind them in bundles to burn them, but gather the wheat into my barn." So discussion item number one, looking carefully at the wording of his interpretation here in 27 to 30, are the tares in the kingdom? No. They're not? No. Does everybody agree with that, or what do you think? They are? They are and they are not. Okay, so I thought this would be a good discussion item.
At the beginning of verse 27, it states, in your field. Field, I think, refers to the world.
In the earthly story, when he gave the earthly story, he said, and then he gives the interpretation, he says that the field represents the world, right? And then, you remember when I went through that slide earlier, I said, okay, I want us to come back and discuss that. Because here, when he says, let both grow together until the harvest, and at that time I will say to the reapers, first gather together the tares, and bind them in bundles to burn them, but gather the wheat into my barn. So the discussion item number one, looking carefully at the wording of his interpretation here in 27 to 30, are the tares in the kingdom?
I think at the beginning of verse 27, it states, in your field. Field, I think, refers to the world.
and bind them. Let's see here, a little earlier. Where is it? Where is there was a reference here to the kingdom. Hold on. First, gather the tares and bind them in bundles to burn them, but gather the wheat into my barn. Say it again?
The kingdom would be the barn, I would say.
I'm going to sneak back to the whole parable. Let's read this again. Matthew 13, 24 to 30. Another parable he put forth to them, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while men slept, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went his way. But when the grain had sprouted and produced a crop, then the tares also appeared. So the servants of the owner came and said to him, Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have tares? He said to them, an enemy has done this. The servant said to him, do you want us to go and gather them up? Why would the servants want to gather up tares out of the world? Any thoughts on that? Think about that one. 29, but he said, no, lest while you gather up the tares, you also uproot the wheat with them. That appears to be saying that both the tares and the wheat are in the same group, the same entity, and if you and you can't tell which is which, so you run the risk of uprooting the wheat. Let them stay there for now, and then at the harvest, God will take care of that. Of course, God is omniscient. He knows who's who. But we don't always know who's who, do we? Okay, go ahead.
Well, 25 kind of sticks to me. It says, while men slept. And then they want to come back and fix their problem that while they were sleeping, they want to go out and fix that problem because they slept. So would that be the men in the church that kind of failed down and didn't keep the wheat out of their, or the tares out of their field?
Here's the question, right along those lines. Do the tares represent people who never were Christians? And the wheat represents Christians? Or is it the case that the tares represent unfaithful Christians and the wheat represents faithful Christians? And if, in fact, the tares represent unfaithful Christians, that's telling us several things. And coupled with that, the fact that he says, leave them alone now. If you uproot them, you could uproot the faithful. Don't do that. He appears, quite possibly, he's talking about church discipline here. And you can't always tell can you always tell who is a faithful Christian? We're good actors, aren't we? Are we good actors? Now, of course, some people are for real. And we would hope that everybody here is for real. Right? Everybody who's been baptized into Christ is remaining faithful. But it's possible, since we're pretty good actors, we could play the role. Somebody out there could be sinning. Somebody here, in fact, could be out there sinning on a regular basis. But when we come here, we look saintly, right? We know what to say. We know how to behave. We know we have a presence. Let me give you an example of this. There was a preacher several years ago, I won't use his name, who was in Tennessee, and he had been preaching in this particular congregation for about 25 years or more. And he had an adulterous affair with a woman in the congregation for 20 years. And finally, after 20 years, the cat was let out of the bag. but he tricked people for 20 years. That kind of thing can happen. We're pretty good actors. It is possible that we might think someone's faithful, but they're not. We don't know what they're doing in their lives. So it appears to me, and I'm open for critique on this, it appears to me that one of the lessons here is, if you don't have adequate evidence pertaining to church discipline, we know that the Bible teaches that church discipline is to be done. 1 Corinthians 5, 9 to 10, for example, 2 Thessalonians 3, and others. But if you don't have adequate evidence that a person is, in fact, if you can't prove that the person is living in a sinful condition, you cannot exercise church discipline there. If that's ambiguous. But don't despair. God will take care of that at the end of time. Now, if there is adequate evidence, so be it. But if there's not adequate evidence, if it's like the tares in the wheat, and the tares are so close to the wheat that you can't tell the difference, since we're good actors, don't be concerned about that. Don't try to withdraw fellowship anyway, because you don't have adequate evidence. But God will take care of it at the end of time. Don't be concerned about it, because God knows everything. Now, it seems to me that that's at least part of what's happening here. Let's go on a little further. I know that I brought up some things here that we'd like to discuss further, but that's telling me I've got 5 minutes. So are the tares in the kingdom? You've got the field, and the field is the world. On the other hand, it looks like you've got a distinction between the tares and the wheat, and they're so close in behavior, you can't tell the difference. So don't try to uproot the tares in that case. God will take care of that at the end of time. Number 2, do verses 28 and 29 teach that we can not always tell whether or not a person is a real Christian? Again, I've shown my hand there. It appears to me that is what's being taught there. And then there are other passages that teach church discipline. How do you then reconcile? Do not uproot them right now, but wait until the harvest. God will take care of it at that time, with the requirement that we are to exercise church discipline as reflected, for example, in 1 Corinthians 5, 9 to 10. How do you explain that? On the one hand, you've got the requirement to exercise church discipline, 1 Corinthians 5, 9 to 10. On the other hand, in this parable, he's saying, wait, don't uproot them right now. How do you explain that? How do you harmonize or reconcile those? Johnny? We have a comment over here.
I was going to say, when you go through 1 Corinthians, you see that a lot of the discipline that occurs there is based on adequate evidence. And even further in the book, it says that without adequate evidence, leave all judgment up to God, who's the final judge. I think I can parallel that with Luke chapter 12, as Jesus is dealing with the hypocrites talking to his disciples, those who are Pharisees. He tells them in Luke chapter 12, 1 through 3, that everything that's done in the dark will one day be revealed, and everything that has been spoken in a hidden room will one day be spoken from a housetop. And he addresses to his disciples that they ought to be aware that the hypocrites are cunning. The hypocrites are cunning. Those who are the Pharisees, they're cunning, and people couldn't discern whether or not these were spiritual people to be followed. And Jesus even said to do what they say and not what they do. So there is a case where there seems to be, though we have to execute church discipline, it has to be based on adequate evidence that can be addressed with appropriately. Everybody in the congregation needs to come to a conclusion that this is the case and this must be done. However, if we cannot consciously conclude properly, then I think we leave it up to God, because in the final judgment, he's the one that has all.
Isn't that exactly what the parable of tares is teaching? Isn't this parallel to what we have over in Matthew 7:1? Judge not that you be not judged. There, he's talking about if you don't have adequate evidence, then you can't go ahead with certainty and make a judgment on the matter. On the other hand, that doesn't mean that you never can do that. If there is adequate evidence, go ahead and do that, because according to John 7:24, we're required to judge righteously. He says, judge, that's a command, John 7:24, but judge righteously. That means, couple that with Matthew 7:1 and following, the bottom line here is the same principle that we have in the parable of the tares. If there's adequate evidence, then go ahead. But if not, you can't go ahead. Because you might be putting pressure on somebody who's not sinning, as far as you know, and then you'd be pressuring someone to repent from unrighteousness from righteousness to unrighteousness, which you don't want to do. We had a comment back here.
This story just reminds me of a personal experience I had when I was a child. My father was a member of the church but was not behaving as a member. And he had chosen to leave my mom and I. And the church had seen publicly, I guess, his behavior and had decided to disfellowship him. The day my dad left, my mom received a letter, probably going to cry, from the church addressed to Mr. and Mrs. It broke her heart. My dad had we had no phone to a payphone. What did I do? Why did you turn your back? And she almost lost her faith in the church, not God, but the people of the church over it. So, yes, discipline with evidence, double check, and do it carefully and prayerfully because it can destroy a good, faithful member.
Yeah, I have seen this myself. I have seen the misapplication of Matthew chapter 18, 15 to 18. If a person sins against you, take with you one or two witnesses, that at the mouth of two or three, every word will be established and so on. If he doesn't listen to you, then tell the church. If he doesn't listen to the church, let him be unto you as a publican and a sinner. So that, of course, has its place if there's adequate evidence. But I've seen that misapplied. And that can put pressure on people when there ought not to be pressure. Or if you don't know it, you cannot act upon that. Don't despair. God will take care of it at the end of time. So it comes down to is there adequate evidence for the discipline? Yes. Then act on it. If not, then take to heart and apply the parable of the tares. We're out of time. I appreciate everybody's comment and your attention. Thank you.